You don't wake up dreaming of McDonald's fries. You wake up dreaming of McDonald's hash browns. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 521, Decision Time, Fight or Flight. Last time, Stalin and Zhukov put all their 1942 eggs in one basket. Shutting down all other major offensives, a large but limited counterattack would take place around Stalingrad. Fortunately, the Germans stayed focused on Rzhev, while entire armies were sent south, traveling by night. It was time. At 4 a.m. on November 19th, the Soviet infantrymen were awakened. The battle would start at 7 a.m. Until this very moment, they did not know of the details of what was to transpire, besides an attack on the enemy. Now, they were given the details. When the tank crews were assembled, they were told, their officers already knew, they were to go as fast as they could through the enemy and keep going. Their response? They cheered. Army Group B was about to be hit by Zhukov's just over 1 million men, 13,000 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,150 aircraft of all kinds. And proving once again this was Russia's lone throw of the dice for 1942, those 894 tanks represented 2/3 of the country's entire operational tanks. As normal, the attack started with an artillery barrage. This was something the Soviets were good at, but they normally didn't last very long due to a limited supply at any one time. That was not Zhukov's problem today. The Romanians hunkered down in their shelters. As for the Soviet troops in Stalingrad, they too had no idea what was happening when the artillery let fly. All they knew was that it wasn't landing on them. Even General Chuikov was caught unawares. Now his lack of assistance made sense. However, fewer Romanians died or were wounded than hoped for by the Soviets. They could dig in as well as anyone else. So when the first Soviet infantry attacks were launched, they were beaten back. The Soviets would try again, but this time, T-34 tanks would go with them. No sense in giving the Germans time to reinforce the targeted enemy divisions. And this worked. Around noon, the Romanian 3rd Division broke at Kletskaya, just northwest of Stalingrad. And 3 hours later, the same thing happened at Serafimovic, even further to the northwest. The Soviet troops, in their thousands, started pouring through. And with these holes created, the Soviet tanks poured on the speed, quickly leaving the infantry and then the cavalry behind. It was a risk, but a calculated one. What would normally happen after the initial line was broke was that the defending rear troop areas would ready themselves. The surviving frontline troops would fall back until they too reached the rear area line, and together they would present a strong new line. But beating the retreating Romanians back to the rear areas was the Soviet tanks. Confusion turned to chaos. As the Germans had done so many times before to others, Axis communications broke down. Supply dumps were either destroyed or absconded with. And lastly, the Axis troops had no headquarters to direct them. The headquarters had no troops taking their orders. It was every man for himself. This is important because General Paulus, who had heard the Soviet artillery barrage that morning, knew a Soviet attack was on, but he needed specifics before he could give counter orders. Finally, at 10 a.m., 4 hours after the battle had started, a phone call made its way through saying the Romanian positions were being hit. An hour after this, Paulus, still having no detailed information, ordered the 48th Panzer Corps, just behind and in between the two Romanian divisions, to head north. They would engage the Soviet tanks, who knew of what kind, that had gotten past the Romanian 3rd Division on the German left. Meanwhile, as for Stalingrad itself, Paulus was trying to wait for more news before deciding what to do with his troops and tanks inside the city. For now, the 16th Panzer Division would stay where it was. At 5 p.m. that day, the first day of battle, the Soviet tanks of the 5th Tank Army, which had broken through to the northwest of the city along the Don River, were met by the 48th Panzer. Problem was, it was an hour after sunset. The situation was confused at best. Still, as the German panzers had radios, Paulus was given an idea of the type and number of Soviet tanks, and with that done, he made his move.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
At 6 p.m., Paulus had all attacks within the city halted. He felt sure the Soviets would not counterattack in any meaningful way. They were probably happy of the reprieve. As for the panzers in Stalingrad, they would come out and head west-northwest towards the enemy tanks fighting near the Don River, which spotlighted another problem. There wasn't enough fuel for these panzers to simply head towards the fighting. No, they had to first head to the north of Stalingrad, to Rhinock, refuel, and then head west. This took time, which, like a weapon, can work for or against you. Lastly, as war is never fair, even between comrades, Paulus told his panzers, now on the move, don't worry about the Romanians. They could look after themselves. The panzers were to make sure that the Sixth Army's rear area was safeguarded. He could not afford to have his entire force unravel, or worse, be cut off. The Soviets there were to be stopped. Destroying them or pushing them back to the northwest could wait. The next morning, November 20th, the southern half of Zhukov's counterattack moved out, just below the city. Due south of the southern part of Stalingrad, about 7 miles or 11 kilometers away from the Volga River, the Romanian 18th Army had stood guard. Had being the operative word. The Soviet tanks quickly ran over their position after their artillery had worked them over. The Soviet tanks of the 51st Army kept moving, that is, until they ran into the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, acting as a reserve unit to the south. Also guessing what was taking place, the 29th had readied themselves and stopped the Soviets quick smart. Its commander, the German commander, General Hans-Georg Leiser, could have launched his own counterattack there and then, but he did not specifically hear from Paulus, so he stayed in place. But he gave the enemy nearest him a bloody nose to be sure. The surviving Soviet tanks knew better than to head right for the Germans, so they swung around. Back to the northwest of the city, the attack here was going better, as it was going according to plan. The 48th Panzer Corps had finally made contact with the enemy tanks, but conflicting orders did not allow the Germans to give a good account of themselves. As the panzers of the 48th were pulled this way and that, not by the enemy, but by their own orders, the 22nd Panzer Division became separated and soon surrounded. Now they were focused and altogether on one page, pushing hard to the southwest to try to escape. Some of them survived, some. When it was over, the 22nd Panzer Division no longer existed. As for the Romanian 3rd Division, well, the parts that still existed, Those men were dug in with their commander, General Mikhail Laskar. Hopefully, their German comrades would come for them. Eventually. On the third day of Operation Uranus, November 21st, Paulus was about to launch his remaining panzers at the Soviet tanks that had crossed the Don north of the city. But just before his word was given, Paulus was given the news that his headquarters on the west side of the Don near Stalingrad had enemy tanks approaching it from the north. They were currently about 20 miles or 32 kilometers away. Further, a second column of enemy tanks was coming up from the south. Looking at a map, Paulus could see that his 6th Army was about to be surrounded. But worse, his support and supply units lay in the path of the approaching enemy tanks to his south. For his army to be surrounded was one thing. To have too few supplies, that was something else. So, forgetting the attack he was about to order, he sent out other orders to those units to get out of the way of the closing pincer movement. As for himself, he and his staff packed up and headed not west, but east to Stalingrad. And when he reached the Gumrak area to the northwest of the outskirts of central Stalingrad by 2 miles, he set up his new headquarters. As the sun set, a strange occurrence took place, which may never have happened yet in the war, but would happen more and more as the months went by. The Soviets, despite no radios in their tanks, were on schedule, whereas the Germans were running helter-skelter, not of panic, but because they were given conflicting orders. It was madness, but the Russians stuck to their instructions. As for doing anything more that night, the Russians knew the war would still be there when they woke up. The next morning, November 22nd, at 6 a.m., Soviet tanks, up for at least 2 hours, yet some of them had yet to sleep, approached Kalach, about 30 miles or 48 kilometers west by northwest of Stalingrad. They were coming from the north. They were supposed to meet up with the Southern Attacking Force, which had a shorter distance to travel. But no Southern Soviet tanks were present, so the crews from the north kept going. A few hours later, they finally ran into some of those T-34 tanks coming from the south. The encirclement of Stalingrad, its environs, and the German 6th Army was complete. Question was, what would those Axis forces not inside the circle do now? With this done, it was time to take back more of their territory. This would not normally have happened so soon, but the Germans and Romanians were still retreating, some in an organized manner, fighting effectively along the way, others not so much. But in Stalin's Russia, the Germans and Romanians weren't the only enemies. As Axis prisoners were captured, some were executed outright for revenge because some of the Soviets had been up for more than 24 hours and were tired, but also right behind them were men of the NKVD. It was their job to hunt out anyone who might have been helping the enemy. As we have seen, even those who hated Stalin and had helped the invaders were not treated kindly by the Germans, or at least by their SS units. Still, they had defied Stalin and must pay the ultimate price. At least 750 Russian civilians were murdered by the NKVD in this area alone west of Stalingrad. Some just because their neighbor, with no proof, said they had acted treasonously.
Pro Savings Days are back at Lowe's with limited-time savings on the supplies pros need. Get up to 40% off select major appliances. Plus, save an additional $100 on every $1,000 you spend on select major appliances. And don't miss your chance to activate and earn 3 times the points on select DeWalt and Klein tools. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 3/28. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. See associate or Lowe's.com for more details on qualifying items.
Back at German High Command, it was the Chief of the Army General Staff, Zeitzler, who first recognized this as a major enemy undertaking. He put in a call to Hitler, who was vacationing at his Alpine holiday house at Berchtesgaden, to bring him up to date. In response, Hitler let the orders fly. First, Manstein, the former commander of the 11th Army, was to leave Leningrad and head back to the area to take command. As for General Heim, the commander of the previous and currently eviscerated 48th Panzer Corps, who had been acting as a reserve force, he was to be arrested. The details would come later. Third, locally, General Paulus was to take command of all the units inside the Soviet encirclement. He was to hold out until help, in whatever form, arrived. Also, on November 22nd, the day the trap had been closed, Paulus was already communicating with his corps commanders, getting a read on the situation and asking for their thoughts. It was unanimous. The 6th Army had to gather itself and fight its way out to the southwest to rejoin the rest of Army Group B. Stalingrad, for now, had to be abandoned. That evening at 7 p.m., Paulus radioed Hitler to ask for permission to break out. 3 hours later, this was his leader's reply. The 6th Army is temporarily surrounded by Russian forces. I know the 6th Army and your commander-in-chief, and have no doubt that in this difficult situation, it will hold on bravely. The 6th Army must know that I am doing everything to relieve them. I will issue my orders in good time. Was that a yes to break out, or no, not to break out? It was neither. Still, as far as Paulus could see, breaking out was the only option. So he ordered his men to start fighting their way to the southwest. The yes from Berlin would come with the rising sun. Meanwhile, Hitler was on his way back to headquarters. He stopped occasionally to get updates from Zeitzler. And the latter, being a former logistics officer, replied that 6th Army had about 3 weeks' worth of food and supplies if they started cutting back right now. And sending them supplies by air would not work. A division? Maybe, for a short time, but an army? Impossible. General Manstein was also on the move. He took his staff with him. Many had been with him during the Battle of Crimea. He was now in charge of Army Group Dawn, an impressive title. But he also stopped to get updates, and as he did, he began to realize the enormity of the situation. Under him now was the 6th Army, the 1st Panzer Army, and the Romanian 3rd Army. And yet, he was told the 6th Army was trapped in Stalingrad. The 3rd Romanian Army was down to 2 infantry divisions. The rest were dead or could not be reached. The 4th Panzer Army was cut in half. Some of them were in Stalingrad, so a part of the problem. The other part was outside the Soviet trap and being pushed further away by the hour. The next day, still traveling, Manstein told Zeitzler he needed an entire army to break out the trapped 6th Army. Zeitzler told him, I can give you 2 infantry divisions and 1 armored division. Manstein knew he needed at least 3 times that amount. The next day, November 24th, Manstein reached the headquarters of Army Group B. He spoke 2 weeks and then put in a call to Zeitzler, which started an intense series of conversations within Hitler's headquarters, which was going to happen anyway. As for who said what and when, the records are muddled at best. The officers would eventually blame Hitler, who was conveniently dead at that point. Still, it was an impossible situation, but no one wanted to say that out loud, at least not to be the first one. They were all still stunned that the enemy had pulled off such a feat. A massive army, hell, several armies, had snuck their way to Stalingrad and launched what was for them a well-coordinated, limited attack. And on that day, November 24th, politics and ego entered the conversation, which can be good for someone's career, but normally bad for the men on the ground. By now, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering was there, along with the heads of the transport section. Of note, Goering was on the outs with Hitler, and had been so for a year, as he had publicly said the Russians could not be beat in a single summer, i.e. the drive on Moscow in 1941. But then the wily Goering started clawing his way back into Hitler's good graces by supplying trapped German troops on the Eastern Front by air. That and the very effective bombing campaigns of the Luftwaffe, like the one in Crimea. And now the rotund air marshal saw a way to get re-invited back into Hitler's inner circle. Before walking into Hitler's headquarters, Goering had asked his staff, can the Luftwaffe supply the Sixth Army enough to keep them fighting through the winter? The answer was bleak. It was possible to deliver 350 tons a day, but only for a month. After that, the planes would have to be pulled and receive major overhauls. Goering now had his cards and was ready to play poker. He called Hitler's Luftwaffe liaison officer and said, we can supply 500 tons a day for the foreseeable future. This was passed on to der Führer. But Zeitzler, doing his own calculations, realized that the Sixth Army would need at least 750 tons a day, and that had to get through no matter what the Soviet air forces did. The only other option, again, was for Paulus to fight his way out, while Manstein took what he had to hand now and fought towards him. The Soviet forces had to be tired and short on supplies, having just finished their dash. But if that was the case, it had to happen now. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, as we see, again, the Soviets have planned this. They have executed it. Everything is going according to plan. But, of course, there is going to be a reaction. So we'll see what happens there. But for now, bringing it down to a much more humble plane, there's us. So I would just like to say welcome aboard to the latest member, Matthew Goodrich, who also donated. So, Matthew, you are my new best friend. Thank you very much. And as far as the other donator, if I may, if that's a word, right? Eugene Citrisky. So, Eugene, I hope I got that right. So thank you very much, gentlemen. I certainly do appreciate it. We'll see what happens next as Operation Uranus unfolds, because even though this is a good start, Zhukov, in his wisdom, and let's be honest, his experience, one, dealing with the Germans, and two, dealing with Stalin, knows he has to do this almost like baby steps. It's just that they're massive baby steps with, hundreds of thousands of men. But this is just like the first wave. It's just going to keep hitting the Germans and hitting. And so we'll see how the Axis forces react to that. So again, thank you for listening, and I will see you as soon as I can with the next episode. Take care, everyone.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore what's critical to this important global relationship. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.